Good evening. Welcome to the Mise en Française. I'm Shani Peer. I'm the director here, and I'm really pleased to welcome you to this discussion about Dan Edelstein's book, The Revolution to Come, A History of an Idea from Thucydides to Lenin, which was just published this year with Princeton University Press. This is the second in a series of 3 panel discussions about new books on the Enlightenment and Revolution. And the third event will be a discussion about Joanna Stalnaker's book, The Rest is Silence, Enlightenment Philosophers Facing Death, which takes place on November 13th. This series of events has generated considerable interest, in part, I think, because the Enlightenment and Revolution feel newly urgent and relevant. I think people are looking to history for some understanding and perspective, if not answers, about today's turbulent times, even as we approach the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. Dan's history of the idea of revolution is also a history of how political thinkers have envisioned the wisest and best system of government, one that can prevent revolutions by balancing social interests and sources of power. But this history also shows how revolution has been justified to restore this ideal form when it is corrupted or abused, notably when a king or later a president turns into a tyrant, for example. For Americans, this conundrum is captured in Benjamin Franklin's words, "Our government is a republic, if you can keep it." Jeff Friedman will be introducing Dan Edelstein and our other panelists and will moderate the discussion and Q&A. Jeff is a professor of history at Yeshiva University and a specialist of the 18th century, whose fields of interest include Enlightenment philosophy and the legacies of Enlightenment in the 20th century. I guess 20th and 21st, we should say at this point. So please welcome me in, join me in welcoming Professor Edelstein and Jeff Friedman, who will lead the discussion.
Thank you, Shani, for those kind words of introduction, and to you and the Mise en Française team for organizing this event. As Shani said, it's the second installment of a 3-part series on the long shadow of enlightenment. It's a pleasure for me to be the moderator for this evening's conversation. Our speaker is Dan Edelstein, the William H. Bonsall Professor of French, as well as Professor of History and Political Science at Stanford University. He wears many different hats. Dan Edelstein is the author of numerous highly acclaimed works on the intellectual history of the Enlightenment and early modern theories of natural law and natural right, including On the Spirit of Rights, 2018, The Enlightenment, A Genealogy, 2010, and in 2009, The Terror of Natural Right, Republicanism, The Cult of Nature, and the French Revolution, which won the Oscar Kenscher Book Prize from the Center for 18th Century Studies. All of those books came out with the University of Chicago Press. He's also the editor of many volumes of essays, of which one in particular deserves mention in light of this evening's subject, the collection he co-edited with Keith Baker, entitled Scripting Revolution, A Historical Approach to the Comparative Study of Revolutions, which is very widely cited in the literature. His talk this evening is based on his new book, The Revolution to Come, A History of an Idea from Thucydides to Lenin, which came out this year with Princeton. The book is a stunning achievement, a history of the idea of revolution across 2 millennia, from ancient Athens to the end of the Cold War, with a little bit of an epilogue, I suppose, stretching into the Arab Spring. The book is also a work of dazzling erudition, drawing on sources in Greek, Latin, Italian, French, Spanish, German, and on one occasion, Chinese, truly.
It's a little rusty.
Hats off, chapeau. The Enlightenment occupies an important place in this longue durée history, but it is not, I would say, the focus of the study so much as the hinge on which it turns. In the Enlightenment, Edelstein shows a notion of historical progress took shape that made it possible for the first time to conceive of revolution as the benefactor of humanity. As respondents for this evening's event, we are fortunate to have Joanna Stalnaker of the Columbia French Department and Daniel Luban of Political Science. Joanna Stalnaker is a specialist on the French Enlightenment, whose forthcoming book, published by Yale University Press, which Shani also mentioned, The Rest is Silenced, Enlightenment Philosophers Facing Death, will be the subject of the third event in this three-part series to be held at the Maison on November 13th, so mark that date in your calendars. In addition, she's the author of the highly acclaimed The Unfinished Enlightenment, Description in the Age of the Encyclopedia, which came out with Cornell in 2010 and was awarded the Kenshore Prize for that year. Daniel Luban's specialty is political theory, with a particular focus on modern social and political thought and theories of capitalism and economic order. He is currently completing a book on early modern social theory entitled Children of Pride, which is under contract with Cambridge. So the plan for the event this evening is that Dan Edelstein will talk about his book for about 15 minutes. Then Daniel Luban will respond for about 8 minutes. Dan Edelstein, we have Dan and Daniel, it gets a little confusing. But anyway, Dan Edelstein will then reply to Daniel Luban. Then Joanna Stalnaker will make her comments. Dan will reply to her. There may be a little bit of an exchange. And then we will open the floor to questions. We'll open the discussion to questions from the floor. We have an hour and 30 minutes for the entire event, and it's a strict limit. So if you could make your questions brief and to the point, that would be much appreciated. We'd like to get as many people involved in the conversation as possible. So without further ado, Dan, I hand it off to you.
Thanks so much, Jeff. Thank you all for coming. I don't know if this kind of turnout for a book on revolution should just make me feel really proud about the book or just really worried that everybody has revolution on their minds. Thanks also to Joanna. It's great to be back here after just a couple months under such wonderful circumstances. Thanks, Christian, for suggesting this. And to the Maison Française, I live in constant envy of the gem that is this institution. So I hope you're all appreciative of what a great place and what a great opportunity this is. So I'm going to try to keep this really short, which means that rather than condense my entire book into 10 minutes, I thought I'd actually take a slightly different path to introduce the book. You know, I did write this over quite a long time. Jeff was just reminding me that he read a chapter from this book 10 years ago when I workshopped it at a seminar up here. So, you know, obviously over 10 years, you get a lot of ideas. The book took a certain shape that didn't have a single point of departure. But there was one point of departure that I think maybe isn't as clear as it is in my mind when you read the book. And it actually just has to do with the status of the French Revolution in our sort of broader historical understanding, historical consciousness. When I was in school, even when I was in high school, and then I went to college in Switzerland, you know, everyone just took it for granted that the French Revolution was sort of the turning point of modernity. I mean, the French educational, like the French historical system, you know, pivots at 1789. Like that's when you go from histoire moderne to histoire contemporaine. So it just seemed, you know, self-evident to me, like the way in which so much of the modern world comes out of this particular moment, as those volumes that my colleague Keith Baker and François Furet and others edited on the French Revolution at the time of the bicentennial, right? This was the creation of modern political culture. But then over maybe in the late 2000 noughts, it's felt like suddenly this position of the French Revolution in global history started to fade. I remember FHS, French Historical Studies issue. It was 20 years after the bicentennial, and there was a lot of soul searching. Like, what is it even about? Like, why did we make such a big deal about the French Revolution? We don't have a consensus anymore. What did it mean? And since then, it's almost felt like the French Revolution has sort of faded even more into the woodwork. Just this is an anecdote, but I remember talking to a friend at Harvard after Patrice Higonnet, who had been the professor of revolutionary history at Harvard for like 50 years, when he retired. And he said, yeah, the department decided that we're not going to replace him. Like, yeah, the French Revolution just doesn't really seem like we need somebody on that. And my soul kind of fell into my stomach. Like, what? How is that possible? For me, not only was the French Revolution sort of the obvious turning point of modern history, it was also like the most exciting historiographical topic that you could work on. Like so many of the greats, Colin Jones, it's great to see you here tonight. When I was in grad school and starting off, like, how could you not work on the French Revolution? Like this was where all the exciting research was happening, and so it felt to me like. Part of this book was an attempt to sort of try and explain why the French Revolution really is at the heart of so much of modern global history. Now, not always in a good way. And I think that maybe a broader reason for why the French Revolution lost this status might be, in fact, the end of the Cold War and the way in which Cold War politics no longer colors the way we think about the history of the last 200 years. With apologies to any Americanists in the room, I think that in this country in particular, there's also a way in which these things that happen overseas and especially in Europe tend to maybe not seem as important anymore as maybe they once did. Even actually Higonet's predecessor at Harvard, Crane Brinton, wrote what I think is still a very interesting book, Anatomy of Revolution, where he claims that it's the English Civil War is the first modern revolution, and suggesting that really from the execution of Charles I to that of Louis XVI, that we're already seeing the basic patterns of modern revolutions. Christopher Pincus, Steve Pincus, wrote another book around this time claiming that it was actually 1688 that was the first modern revolution. And so I wanted to come up with a strong argument for why we needed to go back to France. Keith Baker had this great insight that he expressed with his usual wit, that with 1789, revolution went from being a fact to becoming an act, meaning that even for the Americans, just a couple years earlier, revolution was something that happened. It wasn't something that you took charge of. No American ever declared him or herself a revolutionary. That word actually didn't exist in English until the French Revolution. And so there was a sort of agency that comes into play with the French Revolution that already, just in the space of a couple years, had emerged and wasn't present before. So that was sort of part of the challenge. How do you explain something that is such a massive historical shift that's going to have such an incredible legacy for European and eventually global history that seems to appear in just the space of a few years? So this got me sort of thinking more both about the legacy of the Enlightenment, like how was the French 18th century different than sort of American Enlightenment? But eventually it also got me thinking about ideas of history. And this is really where the book's thesis lies, that definitions of revolution are in a way indexed on theories of history, that what becomes new during the French Enlightenment is this idea that history could be progressive. It could have a direction heading towards greater justice, greater truth, greater rationality. And suddenly, with this new historical conception, revolution goes from being something that you want to avoid at all costs to becoming the catalyst for accessing these higher stages of historical development. And that really the American Revolution was still more or less in this classical mode, and this is why the book starts with Thucydides, whereby history is kind of mercurial, human nature is never going to change. This is the lesson that, since I'm at Columbia, I know that everybody has studied, the Peloponnesian War, and so if I refer to, the revolution in Corcyra, you'll all nod and remember what Thucydides says at 383. I'll leave it at that. But this idea, right, that in fact revolutions just reveal human nature. They reveal the way in which we have this thin veneer of civilization, and take that away, we just become barbarians, and we're, fathers kill sons, everything goes to hell. But that was also because there was no real vision of where would history go. As Marcus Aurelius writes in the Meditations, observe the world for 40 years or for 10,000 years, what else do you learn, right? It's always more or less the same. So that was really the ultimate sort of thesis of the book, that it's once you change these ideas of history that revolution goes from being the problem that political theory is supposed to solve to becoming the solution to all of our political problems, which is what it will become for many after the French Revolution. So I will stop there under my 15 minutes and look forward to hearing what others have to say.
There are seats in the front. Sorry.
So, Daniel.
Okay, great. Well, yeah, thanks to Joanna for inviting me, and everyone at the Maison Francaise for letting me be a part of this event. Thanks especially to Dan Edelstein for giving us the opportunity to discuss this wonderful book. Joanna and I are going to be pretty brief in our remarks, since I'm sure there are a lot of people who want to ask questions. So I won't dwell on everything that's noteworthy and admirable in the book.
No, please do.
I was expecting you to do a little bit more synopsis, which I'm not going to do, but that means you just have to go out and read it yourself. Let me just echo Jeff that it's really impressive as a work of scholarship. So I think it's pretty rare to find a work that ranges across such a wide temporal and geographic span, but that does so in a way that never comes off as sort of superficial or dilettantish. So, I dabble in the ancients a little bit. I have a chapter about St. Augustine in my book, but, this book doesn't just dabble. It really does not, groundbreaking, I think, analysis of ancient authors and a lot of authors who are outside the purview, perhaps, of a typical Enlightenment scholar. It's a book whose subtitle is History of an Idea from Thucydides to Lenin, and has actual interesting things to say about both Thucydides and Lenin, which I think is very impressive. So I'll just focus in on a couple questions related to one particular theme in the book, which is the theme of historical progress that you highlighted. And if there's time, we can return to others over the course of the discussion. So underneath the whole wealth of detail about particular cases, the book is built around a basic dichotomy between pre-modern and modern revolutions, as Dan already alluded to. So modern, in this case, meaning something quite late. In this case, it really comes into its own in 1789 and not in 1776, 1688, or any other time. The key theorist for the pre-modern concept of revolution, the book argues, is Polybius, the Greek-born historian of Rome of the 2nd century BCE, with revolution serving as essentially a translation of his Greek term anasyklosis. This referred to a cyclical conception of history, which we can find some premonitions of already in Plato and Aristotle. And it implies what we might anachronistically call a sort of conservative outlook, in which the goal is to stop the cycle of historical change between regimes and establish something relatively permanent. Polybius' own solution, once again with some visible roots in Aristotle, is the so-called mixed constitution, which combines aspects of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. And so with occasional aberrations, like the most radical phase of the English Civil War, it was this Polybian synthesis, as Edelstein calls it, that dominated thinking about revolution until quite late. So against the idea of the late 18th century as a sort of unified age of revolution or age of democratic revolution with American, French, Haitian branches. The book argues that the American Revolution should really be considered the last one that took place within the plebeian tradition. And the French Revolution is starkly different and novel in inaugurating the truly modern concept of revolution. And so, as Edelstein puts it, from a longue durée perspective, it's the contrast between those revolutionaries who formulated arguments within the plebeian synthesis and those that rejected it that stands out as the most meaningful difference for the history of revolution. So what changes with the modern revolution, the modern concept of revolution? The book persistently rejects one familiar line of argument, which holds that modern revolutions are the heirs of apocalyptic religious currents, attempting to immanentize the eschaton, in Eric Voegelin's phrase, and bring heaven down to earth. In fact, Edelstein argues the key ingredient of modern revolution is resolutely secular and rooted in the Enlightenment. So it is, as he already alluded to, the modern notion of historical progress. And one of the book's most striking claims is that this conception of progress is inherently tied to a kind of anti-pluralist politics. So to believe in a mixed constitution, as the plebeians did, accepts that there will inevitably be differing beliefs and interests that need to be balanced. Whereas, quote, if history is progressing towards a singular goal, there's little room for negotiation. Anyone who disagrees with you is not only wrong, but counter-revolutionary. In that respect, although it's not stated in so many words, we get the sense that the modern concept of revolution is not only different from the pre-modern one, but perhaps inferior to it. And the book's conclusion suggests that we must give up the doctrine of historical progress in favor of a more modest goal, a sort of prudent hope that we might solve specific problems on a more piecemeal basis. So in the remainder of my remarks, I'd just like to raise some questions or doubts about this aspect of the book's argument. So to begin with, it's not clear to me that there is a single uniform doctrine of historical progress, or that a belief in progress necessarily entails a politics that's so kind of resolutely anti-pluralist and unable to tolerate difference. After all, even in what might seem to be the quintessential exemplar of the modern concept of revolution, the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels do envision an ultimate society in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. So each of us will maybe develop in our own particular ways, even if they're different from one another. And while it's fair to say that the Marxist tradition has not, in most cases, been terribly pluralistic in practice, there do seem to be other doctrines of historical progress available that do seem more pluralistic. So what's so bad, for instance, about a loosely Deweyan understanding of historical progress, like Columbia's own John Dewey, that's based around democratic experimentation rather than the sort of unilateral imposition of a single vision. But beyond this, I also wonder how much we can avoid some notion of historical progress, certainly not as an inevitability, but at least as a kind of theoretical possibility necessary to have a coherent politics in the modern world. And here I'd bring to the foreground one aspect that tends to be somewhat muted in the book, which is the interplay between ideas of historical progress and a more visceral sense that the material world around us is changing in dramatic ways. The book has some sensible warnings against attempts to reduce the history of ideas to mere superstructure. And I would similarly resist the idea that theorists of progress were simply, translating material changes in some sort of inevitable or rote way. But at the same time, I'm not sure we can understand why the 18th century developed conceptions of historical progress without keeping in mind that they were trying to capture a set of material changes that were hard to deny from either an optimistic or a pessimistic perspective. So whether you took a more optimistic Voltairean view of them or a more pessimistic Rousseauvian one. So without being strict economic reductionists, might we have to allow for some interplay between the material and intellectual domains? And if we think that modern society, certainly for the last few centuries, has been characterized by some sort of continual process of material growth, material dislocation, then it's understandable why older cyclical visions like Polybius's fell out of favor. So they didn't seem to capture the sense that modern history wasn't just circling around, but heading in some direction, again, for better or for worse, so that even if there were cycles, they might look less like circles than like expanding spirals. And if we are inevitably moving somewhere, whether that's a good or bad thing, then it might seem like you can't just engage in a kind of prudent balancing act designed to keep the system in place. You also have to try to steer it someplace or other. So I don't think this sense of inevitable change and directionality requires us to have some sort of Pollyanna-ish sense that things are inevitably going to get better. And certainly at the present moment, you'd have to be fairly naive to believe that such a thing is the case. But if we do have the necessary task of steering in some direction in conditions of rapid change, doesn't that mean that doing this task successfully would involve something that we call progress? And in that sense, we might seem to need a notion of progress, at least as a possibility for making sense of what we're doing. And maybe we should hope to jettison as much of the concept's objectionable baggage, but not to imagine that we could get rid of it altogether. Anyway, with that, I'll end my remarks and let us get started on the discussion. So thank you again.
So I'll try to be just very brief in the interest of time, but that was a really great point, and I think you raised some really interesting questions. I think I'll just make two quick points. One is I don't mean to mount a normative account against progress. I think I am really through and through a historian. So what I'm saying about modern progress is more really empirical, like that's just how it manifests itself for most of the time. Not that it's impossible to have a sort of a more pluralistic vision a la Dewey or others. And then I also, I struggled a lot with the conclusion of this book. I didn't want to play prophet because I'm really not one, and I don't think that at least myself, I didn't really feel like that was where I wanted to end. So the way I tried to end the book was really just, again, sort of more of an empirical observation. I think we are moderns living in a world designed by ancients. And that's not a normative statement. I think I'm a modern. I mean, I think we all are, as you said, like we can't really think our societies without some concept of progress, which makes us moderns even with a small m, if not with like the capital M stomping over society. But there's a problem there, which is that, our Constitution and many of our political theories were designed with a different theory of history in mind. So, I'm not saying this is working by any means, and I think it's pretty clear that it's not, but that what we call, congressional gridlock and the things that upset us, like government isn't working, sometimes imagine bringing Madison back from the dead and him going, well, exactly. That's how it's supposed to work. That's how we designed it. Like what you see as a bug for us was a feature. Now, that's just like a huge problem, because I don't know how we fix that without finding other modern forms of governance. But most of those modern forms of governance are the ones that I talk about in the book that don't end up very well. So in a way, I sort of wanted to end almost on an aporia than on a recommendation or anything.
Thank you so much. Really glad to see everyone here and to have you back, Dan. So I'm going to echo a lot of the very positive things that have been said. I felt like you were both taking words out of my mouth when you were praising this book, and also echo some of Daniel's remarks and questions about this. So a sure sign of a good book is when it sparks a lively discussion, and this book, Dan, definitely did that for me and the students in my What's Left of Enlightenment seminar last week. They had a lot of questions. You had a lot of questions because you're all here tonight. The book is spirited, engaging, and stunningly self-confident, like so much of your previous work. It's a major achievement, so congratulations. You make a strong case, as you've mentioned, that that ideas matter to the unfolding of history and politics, at least more than Marx and some social scientists would have it. And the broad question that I want to raise here is whose ideas matter to the history of the idea of revolution? Whose ideas win out in history, and also whose ideas do we retain in our historiographical accounts? So as Daniel mentioned, the subtitle is A History of an Idea from Thucydides to Lenin, and the erudition that is required to treat all of the figures in between, not just Thucydides and Lenin, but all of the figures in between, major players, minor players, is simply astonishing. And many of my students who are here tonight remarked upon that in our discussion. And again, as Daniel has said, this is done in an informed way and also with great aplomb. It's one of the most impressive features of the book. But I do have to say, a confession here, Thucydides has been removed from the literature humanities syllabus, and there's an alum who writes to me every time something in the world happens and says, Thucydides is what we need in order to deal with this moment, the Iraq War, you know, like again. So we need him back. Maybe your book will do it. So an astonishing array of figures, but no women. Those of you who were here for the last event will be used to hearing me say this, none. The index is instructive. A quick look at it reveals that there are 3 women in the index, all rulers and all referred to in passing. Catherine II of Russia, referred to because Voltaire addressed a letter to her, and Queens Mary II and Anne of Britain. So there are no women thinkers in the book. Women are absent from the debates around the idea of revolution that, as you show, played such an essential role in modern history and politics. But it's not enough for me to complain that there are no women. What I want to articulate is why this absence matters to your particular account of the idea of revolution and how it might have changed your conclusions, Dan, if you had included 1 or 2 women in your book. You make a compelling case that the new and modern idea of historical progress emerged in tandem with and was perhaps a precondition for a positive view of revolution that was unknown among the ancients. Daniel has referred to this already. I found this argument fully convincing and deeply illuminating. It changes really the way that I saw this sort of long history. But then you take another step. Both this idea of progress and this newly positive view of revolution were fundamentally anti-pluralist. Again, Daniel has referred to this aspect. And because they were anti-pluralist, they led to the intractable violence that has marked the history of modern revolutions. And I quote you, anti-pluralist, the modern doctrine of progress could turn murderous. There was one positive endpoint to progress. There was one way the revolution should end up. Enlightenment thinkers and then revolutionaries themselves were somehow shockingly naive about the disagreements and violence that would ensue from their modern view of progress and revolution. This is the meaning of your opening gambit and the strawberry on the cover of your book, which I think, was it your brother who is the artist for this?
15-year-old.
Your 15, oh, your son. Yeah. Goodness. Very impressive. He must be super thrilled by that. So there's this opening gambit, if you haven't read the book yet, about an anti-revolutionary joke, the punchline to which is, come the revolution, everyone will like strawberries and cream. There's no choice about your preferences in the revolution to come. But where does this idea of anti-pluralism and inevitable violence come from? You suggest that it is structural and therefore somehow ineluctable. But I think that it is due at least in part to your cast of characters. There is some cherry picking going on here and also some erasure of the historical record. So in your answer just now, you've said this is empirical, this is just the way things were, but I want to look at how it would shift if we changed the cast of characters. For the period I know best, the Enlightenment, you present an unusual cast of relatively minor figures. And again, this is one of the impressive things about the book. You're going to learn, I learned in reading it, about people that you don't necessarily know in the way that you know Rousseau and others. The Abbé Saint-Pierre, d'Argenson, Turgot, Condorcet. The case of Condorcet is instructive. Even as he was himself fleeing from revolutionary violence, he somehow managed to pen the most optimistic account of human progress imaginable, his sketch for a historical picture of the progress of the human spirit. He was seemingly blind to the disagreements and violence inherent in the modern revolutionary process. This example makes your case clearly and convincingly. But I found your positioning of somewhat more familiar figures somewhat muddled. Rousseau, who plays a bit part in the book, comes off, as, by my reading at least, as an ancient and anti-revolutionary, someone hostile to the modern idea of progress. This is true, of course, to some extent, and he said so himself, especially in his tortured dialogues or Rousseau, Judge of Jean-Jacques, where he really gives an overview of his philosophical system. But Rousseau also develops the notion of human perfectibility in his second discourse, which is on the contemporary civilization syllabus for the second year of our core curriculum. Based in human instinct, which differs from animal instinct because it is open-ended, perfectibility is essentially and by definition itself open-ended, and thus it is subject to change and contestation. It is not by any means anti-pluralist, at least by my reading, and it is certainly connected to notions of progress, although it cannot be reduced to notions of progress. But as I've said, I want to ask you about women, Dan, and as I gave you a little advance heads up, one woman in particular. I want to ask you about Émilie du Châtelet, and more broadly about the question of the scientific revolution. The narrative of the scientific revolution featured prominently in your earlier book on the Enlightenment, a genealogy, and so I was curious about its absence here, especially because you mentioned changing conceptions of human time that undoubtedly had scientific underpinnings in the period. In other words, the discovery of deep time, the long history of the Earth, and human history just being a brief flicker on that much dramatically expanded sense of time. You give a key role to Voltaire in introducing a positive view of cultural revolution in his Age of Louis XIV, published in 1751. And I quote, "It was this identification of revolution with cultural progress that allowed Voltaire and others to reintroduce the term to the political realm and flip its value." So a key moment in this story. But as Andrew Janiak has recently shown in The Enlightenment's Most Dangerous Woman, Émilie du Châtelet opened her magnum opus, Foundations of Physics, with the idea of a revolution or a series of revolutions in the sciences and philosophy. This work was published first anonymously in 1740, over a decade before Voltaire's Age of Louis XIV, and it had a tremendous influence across Europe before it was erased from the philosophical and historical record, which is the topic of Janiak's book. And of course, Voltaire and Châtelet were living together in her chateau at Cirey in the 1730s and the 1740s when the Age of Louis XIV was, when Voltaire was conceiving the Age of the Louis XIV. But I don't want to just say that Châtelet influenced Voltaire, although of course she did. More crucially, I want to emphasize that her conception of this scientific and philosophical revolution was fundamentally pluralist. Yes, science moved ahead in the pursuit of truth, so you have that forward-looking sense of progress, but, quote, this is Châtelet, "It is not given to a single man nor to a single century to know everything. Each philosopher saw something, and none of them saw everything." This is why Châtelet, 4 decades before Kant's What is Enlightenment, insisted, as Kant would later do to great acclaim, that each person must use their own reason and believe no authority figure on the strength of their name alone. Dare to know. Kant, as Janiak has also shown, read Châtelet and was profoundly influenced by her before mocking her by imagining her with a beard. So how might Châtelet's pluralist view of scientific revolution have affected her view of political revolution? We don't know. She died from complications of childbirth in 1749 at the age of 42. I'm not bringing up the erasure of women from this book for the sake of it or to take you to task. Rather, I'm asking what it does to your account, and above all, what it does to the conclusions that you reach. And I also want to raise the question more broadly for the field of intellectual history in terms of the presence and absence of women in that field. As I said, my students and I greatly enjoyed reading your book and found it deeply illuminating. But it is also, and this has been touched on by my read, a profoundly pessimistic book. and I certainly understand that pessimism in our current moment. We seem caught between, on the one hand, rearguard classical attempts to shore up a constitutional balance of powers unsuited to our modern selves. You've just said the quotation that I wanted to quote, "We are moderns living in a world made by ancients," a quotation that shows you how well written this book is. And on the other hand, a cycle of forward-looking revolutions that cannot seem to escape the plague of internecine violence. At our first series in this event, Antoine presented us with a resolutely pluralist Enlightenment, and one marked not by naive meta-narratives of human progress, but by the, quote, veil of worry, as he put it, about modernity and the impact of Europe on the rest of the world. So just trying to put those two discussions together, I really want to ask you, where is that Enlightenment in your account? Can it still be reactivated in our current moment? Can it lead us out of the darkness?
Wow. Thanks so much, Joanna. That was very poignant and very thoughtful commentary. I think that having written a book on the Enlightenment a long time ago now, when I revisited the Enlightenment for this book, it was kind of a different Enlightenment. It was really the later Enlightenment. And I tried to sort of signal that by pointing out how someone like Voltaire or Rousseau really was still thinking in this more classical mode earlier in his writing. The first conclusion of Voltaire's sort of global history, called the Essai sur les mœurs, the first conclusion was, I have now surveyed thousands of years of human history. What does it all amount to? A theater of revolutions and murder. So there it's pretty clear, he's not using revolution in a positive way at all. It's a very much in this sort of plebeian sense that's what drives history, are all of these revolutions that are simply resulting in destruction and death. And I think that there's something interesting that happens in the second half of the 18th century, which might be related also to material changes. This is sort of, there's a buzz, one might say, around electricity, around hot air balloons, things that are just transforming the imagination even of 18th century, where even someone like Voltaire goes from being this kind of cautious, thoughtful, more classical thinker, more humble, the sort of what Darton once referred to as I think it was the modest epistemology, trimming the tree of knowledge kind of Enlightenment, to this more triumphalist, hyper-progressive, and maybe I would now add, based on your comments, masculine idea, in a sense that there's a kind of testosterone-charged vision here of we are getting to the truth and nothing will stop us. That's ad-libbing, so don't hold me to it.
I'm writing down
Oh, great. There we go.
Thank you.
There you go. So I think that, in a sense, the Enlightenment that I talk about in this book is the Enlightenment that I'm also a bit less comfortable with myself. It's not the Enlightenment that if I were to, like Antoine does, sort of say we could go back to the 18th century and find models for how to think. Condorcet would not be at the top of my list. Turgot would not be at the top of my list. There is a kind of, I think, was it cheerily self-confident? But there's a kind of hyper-confidence that you find in these thinkers. And I think it is also quite different to what you're describing with Émilie du Châtelet. And I will confess, I did not catch the reference to revolution in that text, so that's on me. I wish I had seen that, because the way you describe it is very interesting and very well could be, as you say, sort of how Voltaire gets thinking about these cultural revolutions differently. That seems like a very plausible hypothesis. But I feel like that epistemology that she's describing is still very much in this camp of the ancients, really. There's a wonderful book by Elena Rousseau from Johns Hopkins called Styles of Enlightenment which talks a bit about this. And I think her insight is that the ancients win the quarrel of the ancients and the moderns, but they all start to act like moderns, meaning that sort of more high, how does Voltaire choose to have himself portrayed in sculpture by Houdon? He's dressed like a Roman senator. This is still like or Diderot, still comparing himself to Seneca. Like, the sort of classical model would be so prominent for these figures, even though they would start to sort of write in a way that was more associated with modern style. But I think that by 1760, actually, the moderns had won. And that's what you start to see Voltaire writing these kind of crazy letters of like, a revolution is going to arrive. It's like in 2 more years. That's why I say the French Revolution, c'est la faute à Voltaire, not c'est la faute à Rousseau, that he is the one who's really pushing this sort of almost pre-Hegelian idea of an end of history that's going to arrive. So I wish that I had included someone like Émilie du Châtelet, just if only to point out that a different modern path was possible.
So maybe I will avail myself of the privilege of being moderator to ask a question. Piggybacking on Daniel's very interesting comments about Polybius, who had a good run, a couple thousand years, but whose vision of cyclical change simply doesn't capture the experience of modernity, including the experience of relentless technological change. And so I wanted to ask about one particular kind of technological change that I think is extremely relevant to the history of revolution, and that's change in technologies of communications. You might say that all of revolutions have been accompanied by media revolutions. The French Revolution is inconceivable in the absence of the printing press. Tahrir Square wouldn't have happened without Facebook and social media. And so I feel like, I know you, at the beginning of your book, you kind of set up this opposition between ideas, and you want to make an argument for kind of the autonomous force of ideas as against social and economic forces. But I think that media technologies kind of straddle that boundary in a way that maybe complicates the story a little bit. So anyway, I was wondering if you'd thought about how one might integrate a kind of history of media revolutions into your history of political revolutions.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. That's a really great question. So first, when I talk about in the introduction, sort of the autonomy of ideas, just want to clarify that I'm really trying to carve out some autonomy for ideas, right? And not to sort of allow the Marxist-inspired political sociology school to just sort of brush ideas off as being, the superstructure that doesn't really matter. So, as I think I say, like, no one's expecting a revolution in Switzerland, which we both know well. There has to be a lot of disruption for people to risk it all and have a revolution. At the same time, there's lots of examples of states where there was a lot of disruption and things where, massive inequalities, however you measure it, that didn't have a revolution. So that's where I'm trying to say, maybe ideas play a role as well. So it is, I think, a modest claim. I'm not trying to say that it's only ideas that drive things. On media, I guess I will confess I'm a bit of a skeptic on this, and I'll say why, both sort of for historical and more contemporary reasons. First of all, living in Silicon Valley, I've just developed a sort of natural skepticism towards sort of these sort of technologically driven claims, mostly because the people who live around me do them so badly. But it was really interesting seeing, for instance, the excitement in, I think it was 2009, with the so-called Green Revolution in Iran, when Ahmadinejad was reelected. There was lots of evidence of voter fraud. There was a big uprising, and everyone was calling it the Twitter revolution. because people were tweeting about it. And there was all these op-eds, I'm sure Tom Friedman wrote 5, that, indeed social media are going to transform the world through this ability. And a little bit later, once the brouhaha had calmed down, it turned out that like 90% of the tweets that had been written in Farsi came from Los Angeles. Right, because there's a huge Iranian community in Los Angeles, and they were very excitedly, sharing information online about this. And people thought that it was, Iranians in Tehran who were trying to, schedule their uprisings. And so I think that's just, it's a bit humorous, but it's also a sense that I'm not actually sure that social media, even in the case of Tahrir Square, there was further studies that showed that actually people were going around passing out leaflets in poorer neighborhoods where they didn't have Facebook that was driving people there. So I guess I'm a little bit skeptical. And then just for the 18th century, if you think about it, I mean, Antoine, again, in an earlier book, talks about sort of the explosion of visual culture as a new media in the late 18th century. But between 1776 and 1789, I don't think there was really that much of a media change. And yet the American and French revolutions went in such different directions. So, it feels like I have a hard time pinning down the influence of media to actual historical outcomes, which is not to deny that, of course, they're using these media and that the media might shape to some degree the course of the revolution. But yeah, this is probably just my natural skepticism.
So, to be continued.
Yeah.
So I think Christian, you wanted to ask a question?
Yeah. I think there's a mic.
Oh, there's a
Sorry.
mic.
Oh
coming
yeah,
around.
sorry, yeah.
Well, first of all, hi, Professor. Thank you for being here today. Is it working? Okay. So I did want to ask a quick question here. So I thought that you made a really interesting claim in the book. You write, the French revolutionaries had inherited the modern belief that as everyone became enlightened, and who could become more enlightened than the French, public opinion would converge around a single rational correct answer. So you've already discussed this a bit. Then you continue, there could not be any real differences of opinion because there were only true and false opinions, and the latter were illegitimate. If there was an anti-pluralist streak among the revolutionaries, it was not la faute à Rousseau, but la faute à Voltaire. So you already started to talk a little bit about this particular moment in the book, but I think here you seem to implicitly challenge an existing historiographical narrative that attributes the insistence among French revolutionaries on a single rational correct answer to Rousseau's emphasis on the people's convergence around a single general will. So I understand the link you make between rationality, enlightenment, and a single correct answer, but I'm interested in why you feel compelled to exonerate Rousseau of responsibility for the anti-pluralist streak among revolutionaries.
Thanks, Christian. That's a great question. I'm going to try to answer it shortly. I actually have an article sometime, maybe, coming out with Steve Sawyer on this exact question. And it's basically going back, so for those of you, just to maybe a little bit of context, back during the bicentennial, when the sort of so-called revisionist school in France especially was triumphant, it was la faute à Rousseau, right? And this really sort of Furet wrote in thinking or interpreting the French Revolution is how it's translated, picking up on some ideas from Lefort, sort of argued that Rousseau's idea of the general will and sort of the unitariness of sovereignty led to the terror. I'm going really quickly, but that's sort of where this is coming from. And in hindsight, I just think that's a really weird idea. And maybe a very, it takes a certain kind of vision of French history to really make that work, meaning that you assume that unitary will can only be expressed by a unitary sovereign, i.e. a king, and therefore this can only work in a democracy if the people is identical to a king. But what's weird about that is that Rousseau gives us lots of examples that don't follow from that, and that there's, he is not a anti-pluralist thinker. He recognizes that there's going to be differences of opinions and that you're going to have to pick the one that seems to be the best for the society. And indeed, there's a kind of, force people to be free. Like once we've made a law, you have to get along with it. But I guess I'm a minimalist when it comes to reading Rousseau. I think actually what he's describing there is pretty much how law works in a democracy, right? We might not like the law, but once it's the law, like dura lex sed lex, as the Romans said. So I think also what I find just strange about the revisionist take on Rousseau is that they assume that voting is this kind of almost totalitarian thing. Like Furet has this really weird passage in Thinking the French Revolution where he traces the origins of the terror back to the early elections of the Parisian delegates to the Estates General. It's like, how does that work? I feel like there's some conceptual problems with that whole model, but I won't get into it anymore. But that's where that's coming from. Thanks for.
Thank you so much.
So we will now open up the discussion to questions from the floor. Please raise your hand, and the mic will make its way over.
So thank you so much. I would like to connect to the topic about the revolutionary women, and I would like to know if there were particular reason why women like, for example, Rosa Luxemburg or Anna Kulishov, or if we want to focus on the Enlightenment, Eleonora Pimentel de Fonseca in Naples are not mentioned in the book. Is there a specific reason, or you were? And just mentioning these three names, I think there might be. I have some doubts that is like only a male idea, the revolution, like, or a testosterone driven or something like this, like you mentioned before. Like you said that it was testosterone driven, something like this.
Oh, testosterone.
Testosterone driven,
Right.
yes.
Right.
So I have some doubt.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, Rosa Luxemburg obviously would fit. I mean, I think when I got to the 20th century, I was facing a huge just problem. I didn't want to write another 400 pages. And so I tried to sort of that's why it technically ends with Lenin. I mean, there is a chapter that extends beyond. But I guess my flippant answer too would be that there's a way in which, well, it's not really flippant, that by the time I get to that part of the novel, I'm sort of more focusing on what happens to revolutionaries in power. That's why I'm looking at Lenin, and I'll do sort of Chinese Cultural Revolution, various others. So Rosa Luxemburg, bless her heart, never made it to power. And then sort of the Enlightenment story, I mean, there's lots to be said and written about, the Neapolitan Enlightenment, other Italian Enlightenments, because this was, at this part of the book, it was, mea culpa, a little teleological in the sense that I was trying to understand working backwards from the French Revolution. So that's why I'm looking really at these French characters. I mean, there's a lot of other Enlightenment figures that I don't talk about in here as well. So.
Just let me know. Hi, Professor. Thank you for your fascinating talk and this powerful book. And actually, I'm here by the chance because you mentioned that about Green Movement Iran. I'm originally from Iran. I was in their Green Movement. That one time, I'm studying in the university. And you know that the 2009, we don't have any specific social media. We have exactly core students and a student in university just try to organize in the movement. And exactly, I remember I was in their movement. And 3 days I was in the jail, and by the chance I go out. And also, I have my thank you so much for mention. And I have a specific questions. In your book, you explore is how to ethic, power, and violence shape the meaning of the revolution cross history. Considering this framework, do you think the woman life freedom movement in Iran could representative a new paradigm of the revolutions, one of the lead by women root in the ethic and spread and thought non-violated resistance?
I'm sorry, I didn't really catch the question. Could you mind reformulating?
Yes, again. Sorry. My question is, are you considering the framework? Do you think a woman life freedom movement in Iran could represent a new paradigm of revolutions?
Okay, I think you said women, life, freedom, right? So like around the headscarves.
And also because I human rights activist and I was been there as a after that is morality police kill is Iranian woman
Yeah.
and actually is 2 years ago by the called woman life freedom is
Right, okay.
actually.
I mean, I guess my short answer is sure, absolutely. I mean, it bears some similarities with the Bouazizi incident in Tunisia, Khalil Gibran in Egypt. So I think often these what political sociologists would have deflected as epiphenomena are in fact often what really do get revolutions off the ground. But at the same time, I think that no one can really predict what is going to spark a revolution or not. There's a wonderful article by the political scientist Timur Kuran at Duke, sort of using complexity theory, basically proving why we can't predict revolutions, because it's just like the concatenation of events is such that there's too many variables. And it could be that at one point something serves as the catalyst of a revolution, but introduced at a slightly different moment, it has a completely different effect. So,
Thank you very much. Looking forward to reading the book, Dan. I just wonder if you could talk a bit about ending with Lenin. It's a long book already, so I can understand it has to end somewhere. But I just wonder, you've chosen a figure which ends something in some ways. I mean, from the French Revolution to Lenin, whoever uses the term revolutions says France. And after Lenin, that becomes less and less the case, I would say. And you're looking at the revolution of the late 20th and early 21st century. France is a point of reference, but it's not the point of reference. So I wonder if you could just talk about that and the sort of decline of the French model, if you like, after Lenin, and how you see that sort of mapping out.
Yeah.
I realize that's another book, but...
That's a great question. I think that, in a sense, the story isn't just about the legacy of the French Revolution. It's more the legacy of the modern idea of revolution. And the French Revolution is the first to embody that. And it's true that after 1917, the Bolshevik model will be sort of replace the French Revolution as the template of a modern revolution. And then that itself will, there will start to be other templates. In a way, almost every modern revolution tries to become the new template. So, with Mao, with Castro, and eventually this whole idea of a kind of powerful modern revolution itself starts to lose its appeal. And that's when, by even the Iranian Revolution differs in that they actually have a constitutional referendum. Sadly, people don't seem to have read the Constitution and know what they're voting for. But then by 1985, with the Filipino People Power Revolution, we're almost back to a kind of 1789 or something more of a liberal revolution. So in a way, I think that Lenin was a bit of a placeholder, and it's not that the book actually ends with Lenin. In fact, the chapter on Lenin is what happens after the death of Lenin, and sort of how that reveals something about how revolutionary authority works. But even there, it's sort of that the French Revolution really in the story, looms large because it does two things, right? It's the first modern revolution, but then also it becomes like the script to follow up until 1917.
Thank you. Thank you for everything you've said so far. I had a question about something you touched on very briefly in the conclusion, which was some of the revolutions that you left out, specifically the far right revolutions, for having appropriated the term and kind of used the term revolution in a different way. I was just wondering where the line is for you for what gets to be called a revolution, and what is appropriation and what isn't really a revolution, in the way that you define it throughout the book. And why do some revolutions, get included? Like, for example, the scientific revolution not being politically motivated, but other ones like the Nazi revolution being out of the scope of the book.
Yeah, that's a great question. And you picked up on something that, maybe was not entirely justified, more expediency than necessity. I do think I like to say I'm not the revolution police, right? So I'm not here to sort of say sorry, you can't call that the revolution. The book is about political revolutions, right? So something like the scientific revolution or the industrial revolution, that was kind of clearly out of scope because it's a different concept. It's like using the word revolution differently. I think, you could totally say that I should have had more on, what the Nazis called a national revolution, drawing on, on Mussolini, who had already used the term. I didn't, bluntly, because it would have, again, added another, 300 pages of the book. But also, it did feel like what's going on there is sort of the merging of a very different political tradition, which is fascinating, in some ways does mimic, it's almost the mirror image of the story I'd been telling around progress, but that after 1917 sees the power of the Bolshevik Revolution both as the terrifying thing for them and as something that they want to capture and try to emulate. So yes, there are revolutions. At the same time, it felt to me like there's less of a family resemblance there that would require so much more elaboration that it felt maybe not entirely a cop-out to say that I wasn't going to talk about them.
Could we consider what's happening today in the United States as the template for the revolution to come?
Oh, so the question was, should we consider what's happening today in the United States as a template for the revolution to come? I finished the book before the last presidential election. But one of the things I do discuss in the conclusion is the subtlety of the classical terms for revolution, because in ancient Greek, there's actually two words that we've conflated into one, which are stasis, which is like fighting in the streets, violence, and metabole, which is regime change. And in book 5 of the Politics, Aristotle talks about how sometimes you've got metabole, people fighting in the streets, but nothing comes of it. But sometimes you have stasis, people fighting in the street and nothing comes of it. But sometimes you have metabole without stasis. You have a regime change, no fighting in the streets, nobody actually even saying, hey, did we just have a revolution? Did you feel that? Did you feel a revolution? And that maybe that is the most frightening in a sense. And I think that a lot of what political scientists would call democratic backsliding, could be thought of as kind of these silent metabole, silent revolutions. And I think your question speaks for itself.
Question over here. Yeah, I'm curious. You set up this dichotomy between Polybian and modern revolutions. Has there ever been a pluralist revolution that also believed in a vision of human progress? And if not, why not?
Yeah. So yeah, I think that you could look at a lot of what I call the liberal revolutions of the 19th century. So, 1830, 1848. These were definitely revolutions that sought to have a pluralistic regime. Like 1848, they get rid of Louis Philippe. There's a provisional government. They hold elections, which Marx says terrible idea. Why did you do that? But they were clearly being pluralistic. And they were also very much, the spirit of progress. Like Louis Blanc was a member of the provisional government. I think that what's interesting, though, is that most of those revolutions faltered. And I think for a reason, which is that they either kind of ended up taking a hard authoritarian turn or moving in a more socialist direction. So you could even say February 1917 as a pluralist revolution, but that then gets sort of taken over, right? And I think that's because the liberals who want to also have this vision of progress, they end up being in a very awkward situation, which is to say, great, we've made progress. Okay, that's enough progress now. Oh, yeah, easy there with your demands about national workshops and all of these socialist requirements you're making. This is enough progress. So they're immediately in this very awkward position, which either then, as Marx would remark, leads them to elect a Bonaparte, or as happens in Petersburg in 1917, the more progressives win out. Again, I'm not saying it can't happen. I'm just saying over those 2 centuries, that tended to be the outcome.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you to the whole panel for this really interesting discussion. I think my question is just another twist on the last question, actually, about revolutions that produce the pressure towards unity, ideological conformity versus the possibility of a pluralist revolution. And I guess it would be about the specificity of revolutions that take place in the wake of other revolutions and whose point of reference is that previous revolution. So that happen within revolutionary cultures. And I think the kind of women life freedom question pertains to that. To some extent, the Arab Spring, particularly in the Tunisian context, I think could be cited. Maybe the not fully actualized Algerian Iraq. So I'm just wondering about revolutions that are very self-consciously happening in the wake of a strong political and ideological conformity produced by revolution.
Yeah, I think that's a great category, and my mind immediately goes to the 1989 revolutions across Eastern Europe. But I think what's interesting there for me is that they struggle, right? And they're caught in this same bind of we don't want that. That really didn't work out. We recognize the dangers of this sort of anti-pluralistic thinking. So we're going to have this sort of more plebeian governmental structure, checks and balances, modern constitutionalism, and then people get really frustrated with it. And that's when we start to see the democratic backsliding and ending up with governments like Orban's in Hungary, the law and order in Poland. And this is, I guess, the point I'd make, kind of going back to something Daniel said earlier about progress and politics. or if somebody mentioned like, well, Polybius, like, how is Polybius relevant today? Like clearly that model doesn't work for our world that is constantly innovating and changing. What I would add is like, that's not really what Polybius was talking about. He was really thinking just in terms of what are the possible ways of running a government. And there's, as the Greeks taught us, you can have rule of the one, rule of the few, rule of the many, or you can combine them. And that's the ideal of a balanced government. I think what he says is actually kind of irrelevant to what's changing in society. What's changing in society might push you from one to the other. Maybe what's changing in society today is leading American democracy either in the direction of a single unitary sovereign, or where I sit in Silicon Valley, towards a renewed oligarchy, maybe some combination of both. But the forms themselves, we're not really coming up with new forms of government. There's a way in which actually, these classical Greek terms and models have not yet been surpassed. And indeed, even Adams in the preface to his defense of the constitutions of the United States, which I spent a long time on in the book, he actually starts off by saying, like, wow, the last 200 years, we've seen so much change, even progress. But for government, if we want to understand the best forms of government, we have to go back to the ancients. So there's a way in which I'm not maybe quite ready to say, let's throw in the towel with Polybius and these guys. I mean, obviously, they're describing a very different reality. But if you think in terms of constitutions, and what do we have at hand in terms of constitutional models? I mean, there are political theorists thinking up all sorts of things, but they're all kind of variations on these same themes.
Oh,
with regards to the pluralism versus anti-pluralism, I'm hearing a lot of battle of ideas among like the main players. I was wondering if you could also speak to perhaps the limits of human behavior and perhaps human nature in this equation. So, did the Russian Revolution fail because of anti-pluralism, or did it fail because we as humans just tend to gravitate towards this need to accumulate power and oppress and have hierarchies in which people are more human than other people?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. I would actually say it's both. And I'm thinking, again, of some of the ways in which, like, Thucydides' description of the revolution in Corcyra, I mean, he could be talking about the Bolsheviks. It's kind of incredible, like the analysis of what happens in a revolutionary situation. You can't be a moderate. You have to pick a side. Anything that it sounds like it is tempered thought will always be overrun by extremism. Words lose their meaning. There's a kind of profound humanistic account of what happens to us in a state of revolution that Thucydides gives that, it's pretty compelling, right? There's a lot there that does seem to be lasting. Now, one of the arguments of the book is also, though, that this anti-pluralism that is sort of built into the, let's say, strong versions of modern historical progress creates a situation in which there's almost a demand for a revolutionary leader. I describe this in the book as a red Leviathan. It's not just that these psychopaths take advantage of a revolutionary situation and come to power, which is like again, people like to talk about, Mao and Stalin, just like, oh, if only like Stalin had just stayed put and, stayed in Georgia, then everything would have worked out. It's like, no, actually, these revolutions crave a Leviathan. They need somebody to say, well, which way are we going? As Trotsky has this famous line, like, no one can be wrong against outside or against the party, but the party has to like figure it out. And usually that means somebody is appointing the members of the party. Happens to be Comrade Stalin. So I think that the modern revolution does exhibit both of these aspects that you're describing.
Sean?
Thanks. Thank you, Dan, so much for coming, for the book. I'm learning a lot from it. I have more to learn. My question is about Albanian Maoism. No, I'm joking. It's not, so,
Dan.
I actually want to go back to this question about pluralism, anti-pluralism, and the Enlightenment, following from some of Joanna's comments. I mean, there's Rousseau. I'm just going to bracket that for a moment and go back actually to Diderot and his eponymous article, Encyclopédie, in the Encyclopédie. And it seems to me, and I think Keith Baker in his scripting Revolutions contribution that you co-edited suggests as much as well, that you can see traces of a kind of intellectual revolution in that article. I mean, I take your point that there's still also traces of the Polybian. Revolutions will come, there's an interval between them. But Diderot is taking this knowledge and preparing for what comes after. So in a way, he's making that transition, however haltingly, to revolution or intellectual revolution as act. He's a kind of intellectual revolutionary avant la lettre, quite literally. And would acknowledging that necessarily have to disrupt the genealogy that you do write, which I also find compelling, that there is this alternative way of understanding the genealogy that takes us from the French Enlightenment to the French Revolution, that actually goes through Voltaire, goes through Enlightenment despotism, that sort of thing. And then a second, just very brief question, what about the consumer revolution? Since Colin Jones is here, I mean, surely, I mean, the idea that progress will keep going, that things will keep getting better, richer, so on and so forth. I mean, did that in any way help galvanize the philosophy of history that you think is transmitted via the mainstream Enlightenment?
Yeah, great questions. So I mean, I think what you say about that article sounds very plausible. I mean, what I really remember from that very long article is the line where Diderot says, you know, by the time this encyclopedia is finished, we'll have to start all over. And that to me is actually more of a kind of modest epistemology, right? That we're not getting to the truth. It is the sort of more Deweyan, like we're gonna have to keep trying, it's sort of trial and error, we'll figure things out, versus some of the stronger statements of progress and that we are going to enter into justice and reason, and we will know it. But I take your point. I mean, I'm happy to consider all sorts of parallel or alternative genealogies here. And for the consumer revolution, I would say yes, and the yes is that I agree. I think there's a sense of galvanizing, and I think these things can have a chicken and egg effect. It can be hard to say like, what's driving what. My but comes from the claims that Bill Sewell made in his recent book, where I think that stating that certain ideas of equality were not available before the consumer revolution, sort of the way in which anybody could, you know, buy a parasol and accessorize the same way that the nobility could, I think that's overstated. I think that there's plenty of classical instances where ideas of equality are stated very clearly. And so that there, I want to sort of find a place for ideas without trying to make them all triumphant.
So I think we have time for one last question over here.
Thank you. I'm not from academia and don't like easy use academic jargon. But as long as you talk about Russian Revolution, I cannot be silent. So when we talk about Russian Revolution, it's really different from everything because it's maybe revolution that was made on Russian territory. But as you're saying, Stalin, yes, Trotsky, they are not ethnically Russian. So would you, I am personally think that it's a misnomer to say it was Russian Revolution. And all people who were, almost all people on the top of revolution were from outside of Russian language territory. It was, again, from outskirts, from what we right now call colonies. So, and you're saying failure, but it's actually was only really successful revolution that had 70 years of history. So could you say a little bit, because you talk about Lenin, a little bit of difference of Russian revolution from other revolutions? That's it. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really think that the ethnic question is particularly salient. I mean, Lenin obviously is Russian, Bukharin is Russian, and Trotsky was, and to some extent, like, it doesn't even matter that they were or not, in the sense that these ideas obviously have a Marxist genealogy. This is a pan-European. Eventually, Mao is going to become a communist. We still talk about the Chinese Revolution. So I don't really think that ethnicity plays any role in this story. At least I don't see how it would. Obviously, the Russian Revolution or the Bolshevik Revolution, which, as it's also sometimes called, is incredibly important in this story. And it's, in a way, it's the first. I say the French Revolution is the first truly modern revolution. That's maybe oversimplifying it, because the French Revolution contains multitudes, right? There's a lot going on in 1789. There are parts of it that look actually still kind of polybian. There's aspects that are going in different directions. The modern part emerges there, whereas you could say that definitely the Russian Revolution is the first successful socialist revolution, and that does sort of encapsulate a certain essence of the modern doctrine of historical progress.
So I think we will bring the discussion to a close there and take the opportunity to thank Dan Edelstein. Thank you.